Let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong about what happened in Ukraine over the past 3 years. They assume that because Russian forces failed to take Kyiv in 2022, because the counteroffensives pushed Moscow's army back from large swaths of territory, because Western weapons and intelligence prevented the rapid collapse everyone predicted, that Ukraine won something meaningful. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? A smaller nation withstands the onslaught of a nuclear-armed regional power. That should be the story. But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how modern conflicts actually resolve themselves. The conventional wisdom focuses entirely on the military dimension. Who controls which cities, which territories changed hands, which battles were won or lost. But that framework misses something fundamental about what warfare does to the underlying structure of a society and an economy. Ukraine didn't just survive Russia's invasion. It survived by transforming itself into something that may not be economically or politically sustainable once the immediate existential threat recedes. And that transformation, the one that allowed survival, may have created conditions far more difficult to reverse than the damage from the war itself. Think about what happens when a nation mobilizes for total war against an opponent with vastly superior resources. Every institutional arrangement, every economic relationship, every political compromise gets subordinated to a single imperative: maintain the front. That makes perfect sense during the acute crisis. When Russian armored columns are advancing on your capital, you don't worry about long-term fiscal sustainability or the distortions created by massive foreign dependency. You worry about surviving the next 72 hours. But wars don't last 72 hours. This one has stretched beyond 3 years now, and the systems built for short-term crisis response have calcified into permanent structures. Those structures solved one problem: the immediate military threat, while creating an entirely different set of problems that may prove even more intractable. What we're watching in Ukraine right now is not the aftermath of a war that ended. It's the early stages of a societal transformation that the war triggered, one that continues regardless of what happens on the battlefield. To understand why that matters so much, you have to think about what wartime dependency actually represents. There's a concept in institutional economics called path dependency, the idea that choices made under specific historical conditions create self-reinforcing patterns that become increasingly difficult to break even after those initial conditions disappear. A factory built in a particular location because of wartime logistics creates a town, which creates infrastructure, which creates political constituencies that demand the factory's preservation long after the strategic rationale vanished. That same logic applies to entire national economies. When Ukraine reorganized itself for survival, it didn't just accept temporary assistance. It rebuilt fundamental economic and political relationships in ways that made the country structurally dependent on continued external support at levels that have no historical precedent outside of colonial relationships. Let me walk you through exactly how this works, because the architecture is actually 3 separate dependencies running simultaneously, each reinforcing the others. First, there's fiscal dependency. The Ukrainian government's ability to pay salaries, fund basic services, maintain any semblance of normal state function depends on budgetary support from the United States, European Union, and international financial institutions. We're not talking about supplemental aid here. We're talking about somewhere between 40 and 60% of the entire government budget coming from external sources, depending on the month and how you calculate the numbers. No modern nation-state has sustained that level of fiscal dependency for an extended period without experiencing fundamental political transformations. The state becomes accountable not primarily to its own citizens through the tax relationship, but to foreign creditors and donors whose priorities may align with Ukrainian interests in some areas and diverge sharply in others. Second, there's military dependency. Ukraine's ability to continue fielding an effective military force depends on the steady flow of Western weapon systems, ammunition, training, intelligence, and maintenance support. Ukrainian defense industry exists, but it cannot produce at anywhere near the scale required to sustain current operations. More importantly, the Ukrainian military has reorganized itself around Western equipment and doctrine. You can't just swap out NATO standard artillery systems for domestically produced alternatives without rebuilding entire logistics chains, retraining personnel, and accepting significant capability gaps during the transition. This creates a structural lock-in. Even if Ukraine wanted to reduce military military dependency, doing so would require either accepting dramatic reduction in military effectiveness or sustaining a domestic defense industry at a scale the economy cannot support without continued external subsidization, which just moves the dependency from military to economic domain. Third, there's reconstruction dependency. The physical damage across Ukrainian territory is staggering. Estimates for reconstruction costs range from $400 billion to over $1 trillion, depending on what gets included in the calculation. The Ukrainian economy, even in peacetime, generated GDP of approximately $180 billion annually before the invasion. Current wartime GDP runs substantially lower. There is no mathematical pathway for Ukraine to fund its own reconstruction at the scale required. That work will depend almost entirely on foreign investment, loans, and grants. Now think about what that means for the next 20 years of Ukrainian economic policy. Every major infrastructure decision, every regulatory framework, every investment priority has to be calibrated to satisfy the preferences of external creditors and donors who are funding the reconstruction. The Ukrainian government becomes an intermediary managing relationships between its citizens and foreign capital, not a sovereign actor making independent strategic choices. These three dependencies don't exist in isolation. They interact and reinforce each other in ways that make the overall pattern increasingly difficult to break. Here's what I mean. Fiscal dependency means the government needs continued external support to function. That external support comes with conditions, both explicit and implicit, about governance reforms, anti-corruption measures, economic liberalization. Some of those reforms are genuinely beneficial. Some create new vulnerabilities or political tensions. But regardless of their merits, they arrive as requirements rather than choices. When your government budget depends on satisfying foreign donors, domestic political priorities become secondary. Now add military dependency. The weapons and support that allow Ukraine to maintain territorial integrity come primarily from the United States and NATO allies. Those providers have their own strategic interests in how the conflict evolves, when negotiations might occur, what terms would be acceptable. Ukrainian leaders must balance their own assessment of national interest against the preferences of partners who could, if they chose, dramatically reduce support. That's not an alliance of equals. That's a patron-client relationship where the client possesses some bargaining power, but operates within constraints set largely by the patron. Now layer on reconstruction dependency. The foreign capital needed to rebuild the country comes with expectations about investment climate, legal frameworks, property rights, labor regulations. International financial institutions don't hand out hundreds of billions in reconstruction funding without structural adjustment requirements. Ukraine will need to make its economy attractive to foreign investors while maintaining enough social spending to prevent political collapse. Those two imperatives often conflict. You can make foreign creditors happy, or you can maintain generous social programs. But doing both simultaneously with a war-damaged economy and massive debt burden becomes genuinely difficult. Something has to give. Let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. Think about Ukrainian agricultural land, some of the most fertile territory in Europe. Before the war, foreign ownership of agricultural land was heavily restricted. Ukrainian politicians across the ideological spectrum understood that selling the country's agricultural base to foreign corporations would be politically explosive. But here's the trap. International creditors and potential reconstruction partners see Ukrainian agricultural land as a valuable asset that could be leveraged to secure investment and loans. There's enormous pressure to liberalize land ownership rules as part of broader economic reforms. If Ukraine resists, it jeopardizes relationships with creditors it cannot afford to alienate. If Ukraine complies, it triggers exactly the kind of domestic political backlash that undermines the government's legitimacy with its own population. There's no clean answer. Either choice creates new problems. Or think about the military situation from a different angle. Imagine a scenario where fighting reaches a stalemate, where neither side can make significant territorial gains, but both can sustain defensive operations indefinitely. That's not an implausible scenario. It might actually be the most likely medium-term outcome. In that situation, what are Ukraine's options? It can't demobilize because Russian forces remain in occupied territory and the threat of renewed offensive persists. It can't sustain full military mobilization indefinitely without completely hollowing out the civilian economy. Young men in the military aren't working in factories, aren't starting businesses. businesses aren't building families. The demographic cost compounds every year, the mobilization continues. But reducing mobilization means accepting either territorial losses or dependence on foreign security guarantees that may or may not materialize. Ukraine becomes locked into a permanent state of partial mobilization, economically unsustainable, but politically and strategically unavoidable. Now add to this something that makes the situation particularly significant. Ukraine's population was already in demographic decline before the invasion. Birth rates were low, emigration was high, the population was aging. The war accelerated all of those trends dramatically. Millions of Ukrainians, primarily women and children, left the country as refugees. Many of them will not return, especially if they've established lives, enrolled children in schools, found employment in Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, elsewhere in Europe. Young men who would have been starting families instead spent years in combat. The cohort that would have been driving economic recovery and demographic renewal has been depleted through casualties, emigration, and delayed family formation. You can't reverse that kind of demographic damage quickly. It takes decades to rebuild a population's age structure once it's been distorted this severely. Let me show you why this matters beyond Ukraine's borders. Every neighboring country is watching this situation and drawing conclusions about what survival means and what it costs. If you're a Polish strategist or a Baltic defense planner, you're thinking through the following logic. Ukraine received massive Western support. That support prevented rapid collapse and enabled continued resistance. But that support also created permanent dependency and structural vulnerability that may persist for a generation. The question becomes whether that's a model other nations want to replicate if they face similar threats. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. The same pattern could apply to any nation facing a larger adversary where Western support becomes the difference between survival and defeat. You survive, but you survive by transforming yourself into something economically dependent and politically constrained. That's not a criticism of Ukrainian choices. Ukrainian leaders made rational decisions under extreme pressure, but the outcome creates a precedent that shapes how other nations calculate their own strategic options. Think about the implications for European security architecture. For decades, the assumption was that NATO membership provided the ultimate security guarantee. Attack a NATO member, and you face the full weight of alliance military power. But Ukraine isn't a NATO member. It receives support without receiving the formal security guarantee. That created a different model, one where Western assistance comes without the commitment to direct military intervention. From the perspective of countries worried about Russian revisionism, that's a deeply ambiguous signal. It suggests that Western support is available, but not guaranteed, substantial but not unlimited, political rather than automatic. If you're making long-term defense investments, that ambiguity matters enormously. Do you build your military to fight independently, accepting higher costs and lower capabilities? Or do you build interoperability with NATO, accepting that this creates dependency on partners whose commitment level remains uncertain? There's another factor that deserves serious attention. The precedent Ukraine sets affects how Russia calculates future conflicts. If the lesson Moscow draws from Ukraine is that Western support prevents rapid military victory, but creates long-term dependency that weakens the target state, that doesn't discourage future aggression. It just changes the timeline and the strategy. Instead of seeking rapid, decisive victory, you pursue protracted conflict that forces the target into unsustainable mobilization. You're not trying to win the war in 6 months. You're trying to force your opponent into structural positions that weaken them over 6 years. The fact that Ukraine survived the initial assault doesn't matter if the survival mechanism itself creates vulnerabilities that Russia can exploit through different means. Economic pressure, political interference in reconstruction, manipulation of refugee flows, all of these become viable strategies once the target state has been weakened and made dependent through the survival process itself. Now project this forward, and what you see is a potential pattern that extends well beyond Ukraine. Western security guarantees become less about preventing conflict and more about managing dependency relationships that emerge from conflict. Countries face a choice between accepting higher vulnerability to maintain independence or accepting dependency to maintain security. That's not a stable equilibrium. It creates incentives for adversaries to probe exactly where Western commitment begins and ends, testing whether the dependency model can be weaponized. If you can force a nation into a defensive posture that requires permanent external support, you've achieved a strategic victory, even if you haven't achieved territorial conquest. The target becomes constrained, predictable, and vulnerable to pressure at multiple points in its dependency network. Let me bring this back to the specific Ukrainian context. The country faces a reconstruction challenge that has no modern precedent. The Marshall Plan, often cited as a model, involved roughly $13 billion in 1948 money, approximately $150 billion in current dollars, distributed across 16 countries over 4 years. Ukraine needs multiples of that just for basic infrastructure reconstruction, and that's before addressing military modernization, social program maintenance, and economic development. The funding will come, at least partially, because Western governments and institutions understand the strategic implications of Ukrainian collapse. But that funding will reshape Ukraine in ways that may prove more durable than the physical reconstruction itself. The institutions created to manage reconstruction funds, the regulatory frameworks imposed to satisfy creditors, the ownership patterns that emerge when foreign capital finances rebuilding, all of these become permanent features of the Ukrainian system. Think about what happens in the energy sector, for example. Ukraine's electrical grid and heating infrastructure suffered massive damage. Rebuilding requires tens of billions in investment. That capital will come from international sources, bringing with it requirements for privatization, market reform, regulatory alignment with European standards. The old Ukrainian energy system, whatever its flaws, operated according to domestic political logic. The new system will operate according to the logic of international capital markets and European integration requirements. That's not inherently bad, but it is different, and it represents a fundamental shift in who controls critical infrastructure. When foreign firms own substantial portions of your electrical grid, your natural gas storage, your heating plants, they have leverage over your political choices that goes beyond normal market relationships. Or think about the financial sector. Ukrainian banks needed massive recapitalization during and after the conflict. That capital came with requirements for governance reforms, risk management standards, international auditing. Again, many of these changes are beneficial from a financial stability perspective, but they also integrate Ukraine into international financial systems in ways that create new vulnerabilities. If your banking system depends on continued access to international capital markets, your government cannot pursue policies that those markets find unacceptable. That's a constraint on sovereignty that operates continuously, not just during crisis moments. The pattern repeats across every sector. Reconstruction creates modernization, but modernization creates integration, and integration creates dependency. Each individual step seems rational. Of course, you want better infrastructure, more efficient banks, more transparent governance. But the cumulative effect is a country whose political economy has been fundamentally restructured according to external requirements rather than domestic preferences. That doesn't make Ukraine a colony in any formal sense, but it does create a relationship where Ukrainian sovereignty is constrained by structural dependencies that cannot be easily broken without accepting economic collapse or security vulnerability. So when you zoom all the way out and look at the complete picture, what you see is not the simple narrative of a nation that survived aggression through Western support. What you see is a more complex and troubling pattern. Ukraine survived by accepting transformations that may prove harder to manage than the original threat. The country avoided military defeat but accepted fiscal dependency, military dependency, and reconstruction dependency that will constrain its choices for a generation. That's not a failure of Ukrainian leadership. It's the logic of asymmetric warfare when the weaker party survives only through sustained external support. The support comes with costs that aren't immediately visible but compound over time. The real question is not whether Ukraine made the right choices. Under the circumstances, Ukrainian leaders had no better options. The question is what this precedent means for the broader international system. If survival against a larger aggressor requires accepting permanent dependency relationships, then the nature of sovereignty itself has changed in ways we haven't fully processed. Small and medium-sized states face a brutal calculus. They can accept vulnerability and maintain independence, or they can accept dependency and maintain security. There's no third option that provides both. That's not the international order anyone was building toward. It's an order that emerged from the specific conditions of the Ukrainian conflict and may now define how security operates across contested regions. The next time you hear discussions about Ukrainian victory or Russian failure, try holding all of these things together in the same frame. The military dimension, yes, but also the fiscal dependency, the reconstruction constraints, the demographic damage, the structural transformations that will shape Ukrainian politics and economics for decades. Because they're not separate stories. They're different angles on the same story, the story of what it costs to survive when survival requires rebuilding your entire society around the logic of external support. Ukraine survived Russia's invasion, absolutely. But what it survived into and whether that position is sustainable over the long term, those are questions that don't have comfortable answers yet. And the pattern Ukraine established, that's not contained to Ukraine. That pattern is now part of how other nations will calculate their own security choices, their own dependencies, their own survival strategies in a world where power imbalances are permanent and external support is necessary but never truly sufficient.